The year is somewhere near the end of the 1st century. In a small house in the Roman province of Asia, lit by olive oil lamps and the flicker of an open hearth, a man unrolls a sheet of papyrus. Around him sit perhaps 15 people: fishermen, a freedwoman, a leather worker, 2 children too young to understand half of what is said, but old enough to keep quiet. The man is not a priest. He has no temple, no altar, no liturgical robes. He is a reader. The document in his hands is a copy of a copy, brought from somewhere east, and it tells the story of a Galilean carpenter who was crucified under Pontius Pilate roughly 60 years earlier, and whom these gathered believers worship as the Son of God. Outside, the empire is doing what empires do in Rome. The Emperor Domitian sits on the imperial throne and demands to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. In every Roman city, including the one just down the road from this house, official altars burn incense to Caesar. The man inside the house, holding his fragile sheet of papyrus, knows that what he is reading is not merely religion. It is also, in the eyes of Rome, sedition, because the document in his hands names a different lord, a different king, a different god, and it does so with names that almost no one, a generation earlier, would have predicted would still be remembered: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These are the 4 men this video is about. 4 authors whose books would outlive Domitian, outlive the empire that crucified Jesus, outlive every dynasty that tried to bury them. 4 ordinary 1st century men: a tax collector, an interpreter of Peter, a Gentile physician, and the last surviving member of Jesus' inner circle, whose written accounts became the only narrative, biographies of Jesus of Nazareth, that the early church accepted as authoritative. Today, 2,000 years later, roughly 2.5 billion people on this planet organize their faith around what those 4 men wrote down. But why 4? Why these 4? Dozens of other Gospels were circulating in the early centuries, attributed to other apostles, other followers, other voices. Most of them are gone, or remembered only as curiosities. So the question is simple, and the answer takes us through 4 decades, 4 cities, and 4 very different men. Who were they? And what did each of them see, or hear, or carry with him that the rest could not match? We begin where the first written gospel began, in Rome, in the mid-60s, with a young man whose own story is half buried in the Book of Acts, and whose voice, the 2nd century church remembered, was really the voice of Peter himself. The story of how the first written gospel got onto papyrus begins not with a writer, but with a problem. For roughly 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, the story of the Galilean carpenter traveled almost entirely by word of mouth. The earliest disciples were Aramaic-speaking Jews from Galilee, most of them tradesmen and fishermen, most of them illiterate by the standards of the urban Roman world. They preached in synagogues, in marketplaces, in private homes. They told the stories the way oral cultures have always told stories, with set phrases, with mnemonic structures, with parables compact enough to survive translation, almost untouched. The young church did not feel an urgent need to write the stories down, because the people who had seen the events were still alive. Then those people began to die. Peter and Paul, by the most credible early traditions, were both executed in Rome under Nero in the mid-60s. Peter crucified, by tradition upside down, and Paul beheaded as a Roman citizen on the road to Ostia. James, the brother of Jesus, was killed in Jerusalem around the year 62. an event recorded by the Jewish historian Josephus in Book 20 of his Antiquities. James, the son of Zebedee, had already been executed by Herod Agrippa decades earlier, in the year 44. The eyewitness generation was thinning out, and at the same time, the Jewish-Roman War was beginning to consume Judea. In the year 66, the revolt broke out. By 70, the legions of Titus would burn the Temple of Jerusalem to the ground, scattering the original Christian community of the Holy City forever. The pressure to write things down, to preserve the testimony before the witnesses were gone, before another fire took everything, was no longer theoretical. It was in this exact window, somewhere between the year 65 and 70, that the first gospel was composed in Rome, in Greek, by a man whose name almost no one in that small Christian community would have called famous. His name was John Mark, or simply Mark, and the earliest external witness we have to who he was is a bishop named Papias of Hierapolis, in what is now Western Turkey, writing around the year 125. Papias's own work is lost, but the church historian Eusebius of Caesarea preserved long quotations from him in the third book of his Ecclesiastical History, written in the early 4th century. Papias wrote that Mark had become the interpreter of Peter and had written down accurately, though not in order, whatever he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord. The Greek word papias uses for interpreter is hermeneutes, the same word from which we get the modern English word hermeneutics. Mark, on this account, was the man who turned Peter's Aramaic memories into Greek prose for the Roman believers who could not understand the apostles' mother tongue. Papias was not the only ancient voice making that claim. Around the year 200, Clement of Alexandria, writing in Egypt, told the same story, that Mark composed his gospel in Rome at the urging of those who had heard Peter preach. The Ante-Marcionite Prologue, an early Latin preface attached to manuscripts of Mark from the late 2nd century, said the same thing. 3 independent ancient witnesses in 3 different cities agreeing on the same basic claim. Mark, in Rome, writing what he had heard from Peter. But who was John Mark before he became Peter's interpreter? The book of Acts gives us a handful of glimpses scattered across Luke's narrative. The earliest is in Acts 12 verse 12, where Peter, having just escaped from prison by the hand of an angel, went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. That sentence is doing more work than it looks. It tells us that Mark grew up in Jerusalem, in a house large enough to host a midnight prayer meeting of the early church, with a mother named Mary who was prosperous enough to own such a house and to have a servant. A young woman named Rhoda is mentioned a verse later. It tells us, in other words, that Mark was not a fisherman. He was not a tradesman. He was a young man of the Jerusalem church's inner circle, raised in the kind of household where Peter would naturally come knocking at midnight when he had nowhere else to go. Mark was also family. The Apostle Paul, in the letter to the Colossians, mentions him in passing as the cousin of Barnabas, the Cypriot Levite who had been one of the early church's most generous patrons in Jerusalem. That family connection is what put Mark on his first missionary journey. When Paul and Barnabas set sail from Antioch around the year 46 or 47, they took young John Mark with them as their assistant. The journey did not end well for him. In Acts 13, verse 13, Luke records the moment with a single unembellished line. From Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. No reason given, no explanation, just a young man getting off the boat at the first hard country and going home. Whatever happened at Perga, it left a wound. When Paul and Barnabas planned a second missionary journey a few years later, Barnabas wanted to take Mark again. Paul refused. Acts 15 verses 37 to 39 records the rupture. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. Two of the most important men in the early Gentile mission split over a young man's reliability. Paul went one way with Silas. Barnabas went the other way with his cousin. The text does not tell us who was right, but the rift did not last. Years later, near the end of his life, Paul writes from a Roman prison to Timothy and asks in 2 Timothy 4 verse 11, "Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry." The same Mark, the same man who had abandoned Paul in Pamphylia 3 decades earlier, the same one Paul had refused to travel with. Restored, useful, trusted, the reconciliation is one of the quieter triumphs of the New Testament, told without fanfare in a single sentence at the end of an old man's last letter. By the time of that letter, Mark was in Rome, and he was no longer only Paul's helper. He was Peter's. The Apostle Peter, in his first epistle, sends greetings from a place he calls Babylon, early Christian code for Rome, and signs off in 1 Peter 5, verse 13 with this line, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark." My son Mark. The Greek does not mean a biological son. It means a spiritual son, a younger man trained and trusted by an older one. By the early 60s, Mark was Peter's right hand in Rome, translator, scribe, traveling companion. And when Nero's persecution erupted in 64, after the Great Fire of Rome, and Peter was eventually arrested and executed, Mark survived. The voice he had been translating for years was gone. The memories he had been transposing into Greek were now the only Greek record of those memories left in the city. That is the moment, sometime between 65 and 70, when Mark sat down and wrote. If you read his gospel knowing whose voice he was carrying, the text begins to give itself away. There are vivid sensory details that read like an eyewitness. The green grass on the hillside before the feeding of the 5,000, the cushion Jesus was sleeping on in the stern of the boat during the storm, the look on Jesus' face when he was angry at the hardness of the Pharisees' hearts, the specific number of fish, the specific number of baskets, the specific number of denarii. Mark preserves Aramaic phrases that the other gospel writers usually translate or omit. Talitha cum, little girl, get up. When Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus, Ephphatha, be opened, when he healed the deaf man in the Decapolis. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? From the cross. Those phrases sound like the Aramaic Peter himself would have used, preserved as nuggets in the Greek narrative for a Roman audience that needed the translation. And then there is the matter of Peter's failures. If you compare Mark's Gospel to Matthew's and Luke's, one pattern is impossible to miss. Mark is harder on Peter than the other evangelists are. When Peter rebukes Jesus for predicting the cross, Mark records Jesus' counter-rebuke without softening. Get behind me, Satan! When the disciples fall asleep at Gethsemane, Mark singles Peter out by name. When Peter denies Jesus 3 times in the high priest's courtyard, Mark gives us every cock crow and every curse. Modern scholars have argued that the candor about Peter's failures is itself the evidence that the gospel really does come from Peter, because no second-generation admirer of the apostle would have been so unflinching about his hero's lowest moments. Only the man himself, dictating his own memories to a younger interpreter, would have insisted that those moments be preserved. Mark's Gospel is also the shortest of the four, and the fastest. It opens not with a genealogy or an infancy narrative or a poetic prologue, but with John the Baptist already in the wilderness and Jesus already at the Jordan. The Greek word euthys, immediately, appears more than 40 times. Jesus does this, and immediately he does that, and immediately the crowd presses in, and immediately he withdraws to a solitary place. The narrative pace is breathless. It is the gospel of a man who knew the story by heart, from a man who had lived it, and who wrote it down under the pressure of a Roman persecution that might kill him before he finished. And then, chapter 16, verse 8, the gospel does something strange. The women run from the empty tomb in fear, and they said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid. That is the last sentence of Mark's Gospel in the two oldest and most reliable Greek manuscripts that survive. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both copied in the 4th century. The longer ending you find in most modern Bibles, with the resurrection appearances and the Great Commission, is bracketed in those modern Bibles for a reason. It is missing from those earliest manuscripts, and the Greek style is different from the rest of the Gospel. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Mark intended to end his Gospel that abruptly, on a note of fear and silence, leaving the reader to supply the resurrection from the proclamation that surrounded the text, or whether the original ending was lost, perhaps torn off the back of a scroll that had been read so many times it disintegrated. We may never know. What we know for certain is that the man who wrote that gospel in Greek in Rome, sometime in the late 60s, gave the church its first written life of Jesus and gave the next two evangelists the model they would follow. Because when Matthew, in Antioch of Syria, sat down a few years later to compose his own gospel for a Jewish Christian audience, he had Mark's scroll on his desk in front of him. And when he opened it, he made a series of choices that would change everything. By the late 70s of the 1st century, the world that Mark had written into was no longer the world that the next evangelist would face. Jerusalem was rubble. The temple, the altar, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, the whole architecture of 1st century Jewish life had been carried off into smoke and Roman triumphal processions. The Christian movement had spread far enough by then to absorb the shock. But for the Jewish believers, the believers who had grown up praying toward Jerusalem and counting their days by the festivals, the destruction of the temple was a theological earthquake. If God had allowed his own house to fall, what had become of the covenant? If the sacrifices were ended, where was atonement? If the priesthood was scattered, who now stood between the people and God? Those were the questions that the second gospel was written to answer, and the city where it was answered was, by the most credible scholarly reconstruction, Antioch of Syria. Antioch was the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, after Rome and Alexandria. It sat at the meeting of the eastern trade routes and the Mediterranean, with a Jewish quarter so prosperous and so long-standing that the believers in Christ had first been called Christianoi in its streets, as Luke records in the book of Acts. By the year 70, Antioch had become the bridge between the Jewish Christian heartland of Judea and the Gentile mission, spreading outward through Asia Minor and Greece. It was the natural place for a gospel addressed primarily to Jewish believers, but written in Greek, with one eye on the Gentile world that was now flooding into the church. The man who wrote that gospel was named Levi, son of Alphaeus, though the church remembered him by his Greek name, Matthew, Matthios, a Hellenized form of the Hebrew Mattityahu, gift of Yahweh. Before he was an apostle, he was something almost no respectable Jewish family would have wanted their son to become. He was a telenes, a tax collector, though the English word does not capture what the Greek meant in 1st century Galilee. Matthew was not a salaried civil servant working for a city office. He was the local face of the Roman extraction system, an independent contractor who had bought, or whose patron had bought, the right to collect tolls and customs on behalf of Herod Antipas, and through Herod on behalf of Rome. His station was at Capernaum, on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where the Via Maris, the great caravan road from Damascus down through Galilee and on toward the coast, crossed the territorial border between Herod Antipas's tetrarchy and the territory of his half-brother Philip. Every load of fish, every cart of grain, every traveller crossing that border paid Matthew a toll. He was, in the eyes of his Jewish neighbours, a collaborator. He worked for Herod, who worked for Rome, which had been crushing Israel for almost a century. He was also rich by the standards of a fishing village. Tax collectors were classed in the Mishnah with thieves and Gentiles. They could not give testimony in a Jewish court. They were considered ritually unclean by association. The fishermen who unloaded their catch at the Capernaum docks would have known Matthew's name with the kind of cold familiarity reserved for the man who took a percentage of everything they caught. Then one ordinary working day, that man got up from his booth and walked away from it. The call is recorded in Matthew 9 verse 9, in a single understated sentence. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. That is the entirety of the call. No dialogue, no deliberation, no internal monologue. A wandering rabbi from Nazareth, already with a small band of fishermen behind him, walks past the customs station of the most despised man in the village and tells him, in 2 words, to come along. And the man does. He leaves the table. He leaves the ledgers. He leaves a job that, by the standards of the day, was the most lucrative occupation a Galilean Jew could hold, and he never goes back. What he took with him almost certainly was literacy. A telones on the Via Maris had to read and write Greek, the language of commerce and of Roman administration, and probably some Aramaic and Hebrew as well. He kept ledgers, he filed receipts. He was, in a community where the average fisherman could not write his own name, an educated man. And when, decades later, the Jerusalem Church and the Apostolic Circle began to feel the need for a written record of Jesus' teachings, the man with the pen and the trained hand was the former tax collector. The earliest external testimony to Matthew's authorship comes from the same Papias of Hierapolis, whose voice gave us Mark. Papias said that Matthew compiled the Logia in the Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted them as he was able. That sentence has been argued about for 19 centuries. The Greek word logia means sayings or oracles, and the Hebrew dialect most likely refers to Aramaic, the spoken language of 1st century Palestine. Papias seems to be saying that Matthew's first written work was a collection of Jesus' sayings in Aramaic, perhaps the source that modern scholars sometimes hypothesize behind the canonical Greek Gospel. Origen, the great 3rd century scholar of Alexandria, in his commentary on Matthew, repeated the same tradition, that Matthew composed his Gospel for the Jewish believers and wrote it originally in the Hebrew language. Whether the Greek Gospel we have is a translation of that earlier Aramaic work, or a fresh composition by the same author building on his earlier collection, is a question scholars still debate. What the ancient witnesses agree on is the name of the author, Matthew, the tax collector, the apostle. The Gospel that bears his name is unlike Mark's in almost every structural choice. Where Mark begins with John the Baptist already at the Jordan, Matthew begins in chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, with a genealogy. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. From there he traces 42 names, 3 sets of 14 generations. From Abraham to David, from David to the exile in Babylon, from the exile to Christ. The number 14 is not accidental. In Hebrew letter numerology, the consonants of David's name, Dalet, Vav, Dalet, add up to 14. Matthew is opening his Gospel by signing Jesus' lineage in David's own numerical signature 3 times over. This is a Gospel writing for readers who will catch that. It is a Gospel for people who count. The genealogy is also the only place in any of the 4 Gospels where 4 women are named in the line of Jesus alongside the men, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Each of those women carried something irregular in her story: a foreign origin, a sexual scandal, a vulnerable position. Matthew is signaling in the opening 17 verses of his Gospel that the Messiah of Israel comes not through a sanitized line, but through a real one. A line with Gentiles in it, a line with sinners in it, a line broken open enough to receive the most surprising mother of all when, in verse 18, the angel comes to Joseph about the child of Mary. Then Matthew does something else that no other evangelist does. He organizes the rest of his Gospel around 5 great discourses, 5 long blocks of Jesus' teaching, each ending with the same formula. When Jesus had finished saying these things, there is the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 to 7. There is the missionary discourse in chapter 10. There are the parables of the kingdom in chapter 13. There is the discourse on community life in chapter 18. And there is the Olivet discourse on the end of the age in chapters 23 to 25. 5 discourses, 5 books, 5 sermons of the new Moses. For a Gospel writing for Jewish believers who carried in their bones the memory of a Pentateuch with 5 books and a Moses who came down from the mountain with the law, Matthew is structuring his Gospel as the new Torah, presented to a community that had just lost its temple and its priesthood and needed a place to stand. That is also why his theological signature is the word fulfillment. Roughly a dozen times in his Gospel, Matthew breaks into the narrative with a formula, that it might be fulfilled what was spoken through the Oshirek prophet. The Messiah is born in Bethlehem to fulfill Micah. The family flees to Egypt to fulfill Hosea. The ministry begins in Galilee to fulfill Isaiah. Even the small choreographic details of the Passion are pinned to specific prophetic texts. Matthew is making an argument, line by line, that the carpenter from Nazareth is not a break with Israel's story, but its consummation. His most concentrated statement of that argument is in Matthew 5, verses 17 to 18, where Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." That is the thesis statement of Matthew's whole gospel in 2 verses. The law is not gone. The prophets are not gone. They are fulfilled, completed, brought to their true meaning in the man this gospel is about. By the early 2nd century, Matthew's gospel had become the most cited and most read of the 4. Ignatius of Antioch, writing letters from chains as he was being marched toward execution in Rome around the year 110, quotes Matthew more than any other gospel, almost certainly because he was writing from the very city where Matthew had been composed. The early Christian manual called the Didache, dating from the late 1st or early 2nd century, is so saturated with Matthean phrasing that some scholars have argued it was effectively a catechism written from Matthew's text. For most of the first millennium of Christian worship, Matthew was the gospel that opened the lectionary year, the gospel from which most sermons were preached, the gospel whose Sermon on the Mount was committed to memory by every literate Christian in the empire. But Matthew was not the gospel that the Gentiles would carry to the ends of the earth. For that, the church would need a different kind of writer. Not an apostle, not even a Jew, but a Greek-speaking physician who had never met Jesus in the flesh, and who set out to do for the story of Jesus what no one before him had attempted, to write it down with the methods of a serious historian. The Gospel of Luke opens not with a genealogy and not with a desert prophet, but with a sentence that no other book of the New Testament begins like. In Luke part 1 verses 1 to 4, the author writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." That 4-verse prologue is the closest thing the New Testament has to a writer's methodological note. The Greek is polished, almost classical, the kind of opening a serious Hellenistic historian would have written. The vocabulary mirrors prefaces by Thucydides, by Polybius, and by the Jewish historian Josephus. The man behind those 4 verses is not a fisherman taking dictation from an apostle, and he is not a tax collector arranging Jesus' sayings into a Pentateuch shape. He is a writer who has read other historians, who has interviewed witnesses, who has weighed sources, and who is now composing, for an identifiable patron named Theophilus, what he hopes will be a definitive account. His name was Luke, and he is the most unusual of the 4 evangelists in 3 ways at once. He is the only one of the 4 who was not Jewish. He is the only New Testament author of any kind who was a Gentile. And he is the only gospel writer who almost certainly never met Jesus during his earthly life. Everything Luke knew about the Galilean carpenter, he knew second-hand from Paul, with whom he traveled for years, from Mark, whose gospel he used as a source, from his own interviews with eyewitnesses, and very probably the early church believed from Mary herself, the mother of Jesus, whose voice can be heard in chapters 1 and 2 of his gospel, in a way it cannot be heard anywhere else. The earliest external testimony to Luke's identity comes from a document called the Muratorian Fragment. Gestateur, Latin list of the books accepted in the Roman Church, copied around the year 170. The fragment names Luke as a physician, identifies him as one of Paul's traveling companions, and credits him with both the 3rd Gospel and the Book of Acts. The anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke, composed around the same time, calls him a Syrian from Antioch, unmarried, who lived to the age of 84, and died in Boeotia in central Greece. Whether every detail of that biography is accurate, the basic profile, Gentile physician, companion of Paul, author of the third Gospel and Acts, and is corroborated by the New Testament itself. Paul names Luke 3 times in his surviving letters. In Colossians 4, verse 14, he writes, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings." That is the verse from which the entire later tradition of Luke as physician descends, the Greek word iatros, doctor. In the short personal letter to Philemon in verse 24, Paul lists his fellow workers and includes Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke. And in the same final letter from a Roman prison cell where Paul had asked Timothy to bring Mark, Paul also reports that of all the companions who had stood with him through years of mission, the doctor from somewhere in the Greek world was the only one still with him. Luke's presence in Paul's company is also visible in the book of Acts in a strange and quietly thrilling way. Most of Acts is written in the third person. Paul and Barnabas did this, the apostles did that, but in 4 sections of the book, the pronoun suddenly shifts to the first person plural. We set sail. We came to Philippi. We went down to Caesarea. The first such shift comes in Acts 16 verse 10, when Paul receives the vision of the Macedonian man, and the narrative changes voice mid-paragraph. The we passages, as scholars call them, continue intermittently through chapters 20, 21 and 27, and they include the sea voyage to Rome that almost ended in shipwreck off Malta. The most natural reading of these sudden first-person stretches is that the author of Acts was personally present for those legs of Paul's journey. The author of Acts is also the author of the third Gospel. The 2 books are explicitly linked, both addressed to the same Theophilus, both written in the same elegant Greek, which means the man who wrote the third Gospel was on board the ship in the storm and was probably the doctor who kept Paul alive through 14 days of starvation and nausea before the boat broke apart on the Maltese coast. Where Luke himself came from is the one biographical question the ancient sources cannot fully resolve. The Anti-Marcionite prologue says Antioch in Syria. A different ancient tradition associates him with Philippi in Macedonia, partly because the first we passage begins as the missionary party arrives in Philippi and ends as they leave, leaving Luke perhaps behind for several years, before the narrative resumes we again on Paul's return journey. Some scholars have argued that Luke was a freedman, a former slave who had been educated as a household physician. An entirely plausible profile for an educated Gentile in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean. Whatever his city of origin, his final destination is the same. The Roman world Paul was reaching, the Greek-speaking world that did not need a 5-discourse Pentateuch, but needed something they could read, alongside Thucydides and Josephus. That is what Luke gave them. His Gospel, paired with the book of Acts, is the longest single contribution to the New Testament. The 2 books together account for more than a quarter of its total length. The Greek is the most polished in the New Testament, with a literary range that shifts deliberately as the narrative moves. When Luke is reporting Mary's song, or Zechariah's prophecy, or the dialogue of the Bethlehem shepherds, he writes in a Septuagintal Greek thick with Hebraisms, because his sources for those scenes spoke Aramaic and thought in the rhythms of the Hebrew Bible. When he is writing the prologue to Theophilus, or describing Paul's hearing before the Roman governor Felix, or narrating the Areopagus speech in Athens, he writes in the polished Greek of a Hellenistic historian. He fits his prose to his material. He also dates his material like a historian. In Luke 3, verses 1 to 2, when he introduces the ministry of John the Baptist, Luke writes, "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness." That is 6 independent chronological coordinates in a single sentence. Emperor, prefect, 3 tetrarchs, 2 high priests. No other gospel writer pins his story to the secular calendar with that kind of precision. It is the way Polybius dated his histories. It is the way Josephus would later date his. For most of the 19th century, the historicity of Luke's geographical and political detail was actively contested by skeptical European scholars who treated his references as fabrications. The decisive turn came through the work of the British archaeologist Sir William Ramsay, who set out for Asia Minor in the late 1800s expecting to disprove Luke, and instead spent decades confirming him. Ramsay traced Luke's titles for Roman officials in city after city: Politarchs in Thessalonica, Proconsul in Cyprus, First Man in Malta, and found inscriptions in each location matching exactly the term Luke had used for that exact place at that exact time. The most famous case was the Tetrarch Lysanias of Abilene, who appears in the verses just quoted. Critics had long argued that no such man existed in the period Luke described, that Luke had confused his rulers. Then an inscription was found at Abila, north of Damascus, dating to the reign of Tiberius, naming Lysanias as Tetrarch, exactly where and when Luke had placed him. By the end of his career, Ramsay was writing that Luke was, in his judgment, a historian of the first rank. That historian's eye also gave the third gospel its distinctive theological coloring. Luke notices the people the other evangelists do not always foreground. He gives more space to women than any other gospel writer. Mary, Elizabeth, Anna the prophetess, the widow of Nain, Mary Magdalene, Joanna the wife of Herod's steward, Susanna, the woman who anointed Jesus in the Pharisee's house, the widow who put her 2 small coins into the treasury, Mary and Martha. He gives more space to the poor, to the despised, to the foreigner. The parable of the Good Samaritan is unique to Luke. The parable of the prodigal son is unique to Luke. The story of Zacchaeus, another tax collector who climbed a sycamore tree, is unique to Luke. The thief on the cross, who is welcomed into paradise, is unique to Luke. Where Matthew is writing for a Jewish Christian community defending the new covenant against rabbinic alternatives, Luke is writing for a Gentile world that needs to know that the carpenter from Nazareth is the Savior of all flesh. Roman centurions, Samaritan villagers, Ethiopian eunuchs, women, children, the prisoners and the dying. Luke's gospel ends, as the others do, with the resurrection. But it does not end there. Luke alone among the 4 evangelists writes a sequel. The book of Acts, dedicated again to Theophilus, picks up where the gospel leaves off and traces the spread of the Christian message from Jerusalem to Rome itself. Luke's 2-volume work is the only narrative the early church possessed of how the movement that began in a Galilean carpenter's shop reached the capital of the empire. Without Luke, the historical bridge between the Gospel and the rest of the New Testament would not exist. By the time Luke laid down his pen, sometime in the 80s of the 1st century, 3 of the 4 Gospels were in circulation: Mark, Matthew, and now his own long, careful, classical prose history aimed at the Gentile world. The story might have ended there. The church might have been content with 3. But there was still one disciple alive, an old man on the western coast of Asia Minor, who had read what the others had written, and who looked at it and decided that the most important thing of all had not yet been said. The man's name was John, son of Zebedee. He had been a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, working with his father and his older brother James, out of the village of Bethsaida, mending nets and running boats long before he ever saw the carpenter from Nazareth. The Gospel of Mark introduces him in a single line. Jesus walking by the lake, calling Zebedee's 2 sons in the middle of their workday, they left their father in the boat with the hired men, and they followed. What Mark does not say, and what would only become clear in the years after, is that John was, by some measure, the youngest of the 12. By the time he wrote his Gospel, sometime in the 90s of the 1st century, every other apostle was dead. James, his brother, had been beheaded by Herod Agrippa in the year 44, the first of the 12 to die. Peter had been crucified in Rome under Nero. Paul had been beheaded outside the city. Of the original inner circle that had walked with Jesus up the mountain of the Transfiguration, that had been with him in the upper room, that had watched him agonize in Gethsemane, Peter, James, John, only John was left. He was also unique among the 12 in another way. The 4th Gospel never names its author directly. Instead, in 7 different scenes, it refers to a figure called the disciple whom Jesus loved. The disciple who reclined next to Jesus at the Last Supper, who stood at the foot of the cross while most of the others fled, who outran Peter to the empty tomb on Easter morning, who was the first to recognize the risen Christ on the shore of Galilee. The earliest external tradition, going back to the 2nd century, identifies that disciple with John, son of Zebedee. The internal evidence of the Gospel, the geographical detail, the eyewitness texture of certain scenes, and the Gospel's own closing testimony all point in the same direction. The most personal of those scenes is at the cross. In John 19, verses 26 to 27, the Gospel records, "When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son.' And to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. That single moment, Jesus, in the last minutes of his earthly life, entrusting his mother to a young man in his early 20s, is the seed of one of the strongest early traditions about John's later years. Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived in John's household, and John, by every credible early source, eventually traveled with her to Ephesus, in what is now Western Turkey. Ephesus was, in the late 1st century, the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire, a port and occult center where the great temple of Artemis stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. By the 70s, Ephesus had become the capital of the Pauline mission churches in Asia Minor. Paul had ministered there for 2 years. Timothy had been left there as overseer, and by the time John arrived, sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, the Christian community in Ephesus was the largest and best organized in the Eastern Empire. John lived there, by the most reliable 2nd century traditions, for the rest of his life. The man who is our most direct human link back to John in Ephesus is named Polycarp, the bishop of nearby Smyrna. Polycarp, born around the year 69 or 70, would have been a young man when John was an old man, and the early sources are unanimous that Polycarp was John's personal disciple. Polycarp himself was eventually martyred in Smyrna in the middle of the 2nd century, burned at the stake at the age of 86. But before he died, he taught a generation of bishops who carried his testimony forward. The claim that the John who wrote the 4th Gospel was the John who had walked with Jesus comes through a chain of human memory only one link long. Polycarp had heard it from John himself. Then, around the year 95, John's life took its final turn. Domitian, in Rome, had begun a persecution of Christians in the eastern provinces. Hundreds were arrested, some were executed. John, by the testimony of every ancient source, was banished, sent into exile on a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. The book of Revelation opens with John's own description of the moment. In chapter 1, verse 9, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus." It was on that island, in something close to solitary confinement, that the apocalyptic vision of Revelation came to him. Domitian was assassinated in 96. His successor Nerva reversed many of his persecutions, and the early sources record that the elderly John was released from Patmos and allowed to return to Ephesus. He was by this point well into his 90s, possibly older. The disciple who had once been the youngest in the upper room was now older than any of his companions had ever lived to be. And it was in those last years back in Ephesus that he sat down and wrote the 4th Gospel. He wrote it by the consensus of the ancient sources, knowing exactly what the other 3 Gospels had said. That is why the 4th Gospel is so unlike the first 3. The first 3, Mark, Matthew, Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be set side by side and read together. Their narrative shape, their selection of episodes, and much of their wording overlap. John's Gospel does not. There is no birth narrative. There is no genealogy. There is no temptation in the wilderness. There are no exorcisms, none in any of John's 21 chapters. There are no parables in the synoptic sense, no stories of sowers or prodigal sons or workers in the vineyard. The Sermon on the Mount is not there. The Lord's Prayer is not there. The institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper is not there. What is there instead is something the synoptics do not give. John structures his gospel around 7 signs, 7 miracles, beginning with the changing of water into wine at Cana, and ending with the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Each sign is more than a wonder. Each is paired with a long discourse in which Jesus interprets what the sign means. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus tells the crowd, "I am the bread of life." After the healing of the man born blind, he says, "I am the light of the world." After the raising of Lazarus, he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." 7 I am sayings, echoing the divine name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush, woven through long teaching dialogues that have no parallel in the other Gospels. The night conversation with Nicodemus in chapter 3, the Samaritan woman at the well in chapter 4, the upper room discourses across chapters 13 to 17, the high priestly prayer that ends them. John also tells time differently. The Synoptic Gospels collapse Jesus' ministry into what could be read as a single year, with a single climactic visit to Jerusalem at the end. John records 3 Passovers, stretching the ministry across at least 3 years and bringing Jesus to the temple multiple times. The Synoptics place the Last Supper on the night of Passover. John places the crucifixion itself on the day of preparation, when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple courts. A theological claim, made through chronology that Jesus is the true Passover lamb, whose blood is poured out at the same hour. Generations of scholars have argued over how to reconcile the two timelines. What the early church understood was that John was not contradicting the others. He was deepening them, telling the same story from a vantage point 90 years on, with the freedom of a writer who had read the existing accounts and was now adding what only he could add. He says as much in the closing of his Gospel. In John 21 verse 24, the Gospel concludes with this sentence: "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." That is the disciple whom Jesus loved, identifying himself as the writer, with a community around him, the we of that closing, vouching for his testimony. The fourth Gospel is signed. The earliest physical evidence we have of any New Testament book at all is, remarkably, a tiny scrap of John's Gospel. The fragment is called Papyrus 52, or P52, and it is housed today in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. It is roughly the size of a credit card, with writing on both sides. On one side it preserves part of John 18 verses 31 to 33. On the other, part of John 18 verses 37 and 38, the words of Jesus before Pilate. Paleographers date the handwriting to somewhere between the years 125 and 175. That a copy of John's Gospel was already circulating in Egypt within roughly a generation of the original. Being written in Ephesus is one of the most striking pieces of manuscript evidence in the entire ancient world. Whatever doubts later scholars might have raised about when the fourth Gospel was composed, P52 closes the window. The text was already in motion by the early 2nd century, copied and carried far from where it had begun. By the time John finally died, sometime around the end of the 1st century in Ephesus, of natural old age, the only one of the 12 apostles to die that way. 4 written Gospels were in circulation across the Mediterranean. Mark from Rome, Matthew from Antioch, Luke from somewhere in the Greek world, John from Ephesus. The men who wrote them were all dead. The communities they had written for were under pressure from a hostile empire, and the question of which of these Gospels, and which of the dozens of others now circulating under apostolic names, would become the Church's authoritative record, was about to be settled, slowly, painfully, across the next 3 centuries. The earliest argument that there should be 4 Gospels, no more, no fewer, was written by a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon around the year 180. In the 3rd book of his work against heresies, Irenaeus argued that just as there are 4 winds, 4 corners of the earth, and 4 faces of the cherubim in the visions of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation, so the Church has 4 Gospels, a 4-fold witness binding the world together. The argument feels almost mystical to modern ears. But Irenaeus was not inventing the 4-fold canon. He was justifying a settlement that had already happened in practice. By the late 2nd century, in churches from Lyon to Alexandria to Antioch, those 4 scrolls and no others were the ones being read in worship. The criteria the early church applied were not arbitrary. 3 things mattered. First, apostolic origin. The gospel had to come from an apostle, or from someone in direct contact with one. Mark had Peter. Matthew was an apostle himself. Luke was Paul's traveling companion. John was an apostle. Second, doctrinal consistency. The gospel had to align with the rule of faith already preserved by the apostolic churches. Third, widespread use. The gospel had to be read and trusted across many congregations, not just one regional sect. By those criteria, the gospels that did not make it failed for visible reasons. The Gospel of Thomas, recovered in Egypt at Nag Hammadi in December of 1945, is 114 sayings of Jesus with no narrative, no baptism, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Its theology bends toward Gnosticism, an esoteric movement that rejected the goodness of creation. The Gospel of Peter, recovered in a monk's tomb at Akhmim in 1886, contains a fantastical resurrection scene, with a giant cross walking out of the tomb on its own and answering questions. These were not Gospels the Church suppressed. They were Gospels the Church had read, weighed, and declined. The four canonical Gospels, by contrast, kept showing up together. The Chester Beatty Papyri, recovered in Egypt and dated to around the year 250, include a single codex called Papyrus 45 that contains all four Gospels and the Book of Acts, bound together as one book in that order, more than a century before any official council confirmed them. The settlement Irenaeus articulated had already become the practice of ordinary congregations. The official confirmations followed. In 367, Athanasius of Alexandria, in his 39th Easter letter, listed the 27 books of the New Testament we now use, with the four Gospels at the head, the first complete canonical list in surviving Christian writing. In 397, the Council of Carthage formally ratified that list for the Western Church. By the close of the 4th century, the four Gospels were no longer one possibility among many. They were the Gospels. Christian tradition eventually gave each of the four a face, drawing on the four living creatures of Ezekiel chapter 1 and Revelation chapter 4. Augustine and Jerome assigned the symbols that are still carved into pulpits and cathedral doors today. Matthew the man, who began with a human genealogy. Mark the lion, who roared his gospel out of the wilderness. Luke the ox, the patient sacrificial beast, for the gospel of compassion and wider mercy. John the eagle, who soared from his first verse to the eternal word. Four creatures, four gospels, one face of Christ turned in four directions. That is the answer to the question this video began with. Why these four? Because four men, a tax collector, an interpreter of Peter, a Gentile physician, and the last surviving member of Jesus' inner three, left behind accounts that the Church, working through 3 centuries of testing, recognized as the true voices of the apostolic generation. Today, roughly 2.5 billion people on this planet read those 4 books in over 2,000 languages. They read them in stone cathedrals and in plastered village chapels and in prison cells and on telephone screens. The Gospel of Mark, written by a young man on the run from a Roman persecution. The Gospel of Matthew, written by a former tax collector for a community that had lost its temple. The Gospel of Luke, written by a Greek physician for a Roman patron. The Gospel of John, written by a 90-year-old fisherman who had outlived almost everyone he had ever loved. John himself ends his Gospel with a sentence that, in a sense, ends the entire fourfold witness. In John 20, verses 30 to 31, he writes, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. 4 men in 4 cities, across 4 decades, wrote down what they wrote so that the people who came after them, including the people listening to this, would have something to believe and somewhere to stand.